So last time we created an empty Optimizely CMS 12 website, and by definition of being empty, there was nothing in it. So this time I want to actually put something in the site, and by that I mean content. In order to create content, though, we have to do some content modeling. Now, we will do content modeling in the CMS, but before, let's talk about the concept of content modeling and maybe answer a few questions. Questions like, what is content? Well, this is content. This is a recipe for frosting, and it is basically some information organized in a shape that you recognize. So for example, I told you that this is a recipe, and so without telling you anything more, you probably already know that the recipe has a name, which is frosting. It has a list of ingredients. It has a list of instructions. And if it were an online recipe, it would also have 5 or 6 pages of backstory that nobody wants to read but exists for some reason. A recipe, or rather the concept of recipe, is like a content type, whereas this particular recipe is an instance of content. If you want to think about it in C# terms, recipe is the class, frosting is the instance of the class. In fact, that is basically almost exactly how content is modeled within the CMS. Content modeling typically happens in 2 steps. The first step is the thinky part. The second step is the clicky part. So the thinky part is basically taking the content you have, taking a good hard look at it and deciding on a shape that you can organize the information into and have all of the different pieces of content fit into one content type. If you're a web developer, this job might not be done by you. It might be a content strategist, a user experience person, or a tech planning committee. But basically, someone else might make these decisions and hand you a document of human-readable content models, which it is then your job to convert into content models that the CMS understands, which is phase 2, the clicky part. Phase 2 is basically converting the concepts and the models that you've been given or that you've decided upon into C# classes that the CMS will understand. Now, we'll get to part 2 in a bit, but I do want to go through part 1 just to give you a flavor of what it's like. Now, the thinky part of content modeling, as discussed, is basically looking at the content and figuring out what its properties are going to be to make it all cohesive. But the hard part of that is that you're frequently dealing with several different goals that are in opposition. For example, while modeling content, you want to give your content editors enough flexibility that they can create content that looks and feels the way they want it to look and feel. But at the same time, you want to put some restrictions on that so they can't shoot themselves in the foot. In other words, you may want to give them some styling options, but maybe don't enable the blink tag. Another example might be that you want to have a fairly rich content model and detailed content model that enables you to use the content in other contexts or across other channels or to gather insights from the content. But at the same time, you want the content model to be simple enough that an editor can reasonably manage the content. These are the kinds of things you have to think about when you're modeling content. And to kind of go through that process, I'm going to take the recipe example and we're going to model a recipe at 3 levels of sort of structuredness of content modeling. So we'll do basically unstructured and work our way to highly structured and just talk about the different trade-offs there are at each level. Now here's the recipe as unstructured content. It's basically a text area and the editor just writes whatever they want. Now this does give us a great deal of flexibility, but it does mean that they have to be at least some level of consistent. So for example, someone had to actually type the word ingredients here. And then they had to list the ingredients, and when they did that, they had to decide, do I want bullet points? Do I not? And they should probably do that consistently. Then they have to put a break in, and then they have to type the word instructions. Make sure you don't make any typos. That would be kind of weird. And then type the ingredients on one line at a time. Again, provides a great deal of flexibility, but it lacks in consistency. It certainly makes it easy to shoot yourself in the foot or to make mistakes. So it's a trade-off. Now here's a recipe as I would say moderately structured content type in which we no longer have one text area, but we've divided things into sort of 2 main groups. The first is the ingredient list, and that's basically a list of individual text items. So there's no concept of 2 cups of powdered sugar. This is just arbitrary text as far as the content model goes, but it is separated from the instructions. Same with the instructions. Now each instruction is basically a step and then the instruction. And the instruction is just arbitrary text, again, as far as the content model goes. Now, it's arguable whether or not steps should even be a thing here. We should probably just calculate the steps based on what order they're in, but maybe you have some edge case where you need to have step 1, 2, 2.5 if you decide to do something or not. Step 3, I don't know. It gives a little more flexibility, but it would be weird to do step 1, step 7, step 3, so there's you're opening yourself up a little bit there. One of the interesting things about having the ingredients be a separate content, separate piece of content within the content and be a list is that enables features like shopping list. So I could select a recipe and say, give me the shopping list, and it can just list out each ingredient on a line in maybe a different format that's more conducive to a shopping list. Now, the bad thing about this is if I selected 2 recipes and I wanted to combine them into a single shopping list, because the content model doesn't actually know anything about the ingredients, it can't easily dedupe the list. So if both ingredients use powdered sugar, I might end up with a shopping list that says 2 cups powdered sugar, 1 cup powdered sugar. And it would be up to me, the human, to look at that and say, well, I need 3 cups powdered sugar. And then finally, this is a more strictly structured version of a recipe content type in which, we still have a list of ingredients, but now each ingredient is like a sub content type. And the sub content type consists of, the name of the ingredient, the amount, and the amount is actually a number now. It is not, you can't just type anything in here. It has to be a number, and then a unit. And the unit we would probably select from a drop-down list of units that the system understands. So by doing that, it opens up some interesting possibilities. For example, in the scenario previously where we selected 2 recipes and wanted a shopping list, because we now have ingredients separated from amount and we understand the ingredient, we can dedupe that list and we could get a shopping list that says 3 cups of powdered sugar. Some of the downsides of this is, for example, we have 2 cups of powdered sugar. When we display this on the front end, because the unit is just cup, it's kind of up to us to pluralize that correctly, and we have to do that in every language we support. So we'll have to have some kind of logic for rules of displaying units, and that's just a little piece of complexity. Another possible complexity is 1/2 cup of sugar. Chances are they don't want that to display as 0.5 cups on the front end, and so you'll have to write logic that recognizes that 0.5 is a half and put out 1/2 cups of sugar or cup of sugar. There's also a little bit of a complexity in that sometimes the units aren't sensible. A pinch is not necessarily a not sensible unit, but occasionally you'll see things like to taste, salt to taste. How do you represent that in this model? I've also seen a pancake recipe because I love pancakes, obviously. And in that recipe, it called for, if I remember right, 1 flat teaspoon of baking soda and 1 heaping teaspoon of baking powder. How do you say heaping in this? There's no adjective, there's no modifier. So there's a bunch of recipes that don't really work in this strictly modeled content type because that's not how we think of recipes. Finally, down on the bottom, I also just threw in tagging the ingredients within the instructions. So combine powdered sugar as an ingredient, egg whites, sugar, butter, blah, blah, blah. If you want to spend the time and effort, you could tag these within the markup in your text, and you could potentially enable some interesting things where like you display on the sidebar what ingredients you'll need for this step and maybe what ingredients you'll need for the next step. That's really cool, but it's work for the editor, and it's a lot of work for you because you have to write that markup and figure out how to pull out those ingredients. So again, it's all about trading off these different goals, enabling some things, but paying the price for the things you enable. Okay, enough about the recipes. Let's talk about content modeling as it pertains to Optimizely CMS. Now, within the CMS, there are basically 3 major realms of content types that you'll be working with. There are media, pages, and blocks. I'm going to start with media because I think it's sort of the simplest conceptually. Media is basically binary content that you've uploaded, files, in other words. So it might be a PDF, image, Excel documents, whatever. Media items are URL addressable. So if you are a user, not within the CMS like in the admin area, but you're just Joe Schmo browsing the website, you give the browser a URL to some piece of media content. Optimizely returns that content usually more or less as it is. So it's kind of a one-to-one. One URL gives you one PDF. Pages are a little more complicated in that each page is URL addressable. Every page has basically at least one URL. And when you give the CMS that URL, it gathers the content for that page, and then it runs it through a templating system and returns that content as HTML. Generally, there are other scenarios, but this is the most common one. Now, blocks, on the other hand, are better thought of as pieces of pages. A block is not URL addressable because a block has to live within a page to be rendered. A good example of what you might want to do, or what might be a block, would be, say you have a call to action in the sidebar on a few random pages throughout the site. Rather than making that like HTML that you copy paste to each page, you would make that a block and then reference that block across multiple pages. It's sort of a way of having content live in sort of a central place and then get referenced throughout the site. Now, I'm going to give a disclaimer right up front that as we talk about content modeling and content types in Optimizely CMS, I'm definitely oversimplifying things a little bit. There are weird edge cases. You'll hear the word typically a lot because everything that you can do it in a million different ways, and it's an extremely flexible system. So just keep in mind, I'm oversimplifying a few things here just for the sake of time. So as mentioned before, all content types in Optimizely CMS are C# classes. Technically, mostly, but just go with they're all C# classes. You'll be much better off. And all of those C# classes extend iContent, mostly. Technically, blocks don't implement iContent, except when they do. It's very weird. We'll get there. But for now, just think everything is iContent, and it's just simpler. In iContent, there are sort of like those three major realms of content types. There are pages. All pages extend page data. Your blocks, all blocks extend block data. And then media is a little more complicated, but not a whole lot. Media is actually sort of three base classes you'll be working with. For images, you'll want to use image data, because image data, if you extend image data, it gives you some nice features like thumbnails in the admin area, an image editor, other things. There's also video data for any video content types you might want to deal with, or other, which would be like PDFs, Excel documents, and that sort of thing. So these are the base classes that you will be modeling your content. And yes, you actually do model media content. So basically, your media content will be the binary data, often called a blob, if you hear the term blob. But you can add properties on top of that. So if you have like a PDF, you might add some metadata like author, last update, or whatever you want. So that's why we actually model our media as well. So I think the next step is to actually hop into some code, finally, and model a page just to give you an idea of what that process is like. Now, I'm going to disclaim up front that I'm going to do this in a very naive way, which is not how I would normally do it, but I think it's important to the learning process to keep it simple and also to show why I don't do it this way, and we'll get there eventually. So we'll just do a naive page type up front, maybe a second page type, and then show kind of how we adjust as we start getting things more and more complicated. All right, finally, we are almost to the code. In order to go through the process of modeling a real-world page within Optimizely CMS, I have gotten permission to use the Blend Interactive, my employer's website, blendinteractive.com. We make cool stuff on the web, and we are always interested in talent. So if you're looking, come talk to me. And yeah, I'm just going to pick a page off of here. We're going to do a very basic model and just create the model. We will work on rendering in the next video. So now, typically, when I start building out a fresh Optimizely CMS site, what I like to do is create two page types. The first is the start page, because you need that to do all the binding and stuff, and that I usually create as just empty for now. The second is whatever page type is going to be either the privacy policy or the terms and conditions, because those tend to be the most basic, simple pages on any site. And they are typically in the footer. And if I scroll down here and check out the terms of service, this is a pretty basic page. I'm not going to worry about any of this navigation. I'm not going to worry about any of this footer content for now. All I'm worried about is the stuff that starts here and ends here. So very, very basic. Let's hop into the site. Okay, here we are in our Visual Studio solution. Now, before I start, I do want to preface this by saying there are a couple of ways to organize your models and controllers and stuff. A lot of people are starting to do feature folders where you might have a folder called feature, and then for each feature you have a subfolder for that particular feature, like you might have a homepage subfolder. And then in that folder you would have your model, your controller review, whatever. I'm actually going to go with sort of the classic model just because that's what you're going to see in so many sites currently. But my unpopular opinion is that it does not matter. Either way, it's just a different organization scheme. Do whatever the project is doing if it's already been configured. Otherwise, do what your team is doing. Otherwise, do what your preference is. Just be consistent. Otherwise, I don't think it matters at all. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and create that models folder. And we're modeling pages, so I'm going to create a pages folder. And we're going to start with the start page, which I'm going to just model to be empty. Well, we'll call this, actually, I'm going to call it home page. Now, if you remember from earlier, pages extend from page data, so we do that, page data. We're just going to create that C# class to represent our home page. There are basically two things you have to do to get Optimizely to recognize this as content type. One is it has to extend one of those, base content types, or at least iContent. And two, you need to use annotations to tell it that this is a content type. So you just do content type annotation. And there's some information here that you absolutely should provide. So for example, you should provide a display name. If you don't, it will just use the class name, which in this case would probably be okay because they're the same. Description is helpful to use, but if your description is just the display name again, it's probably not super helpful. The next one that you absolutely should have is GUID. And the GUID just needs to be a unique identifier. There's nothing special about this. You can grab one online. I wrote a little utility that will just put one on my clipboard whenever I click on it. And the important thing is that it's just a unique identifier. And what the GUID does is it allows you to rename the class or move the namespace or whatever. Because the GUID is consistent, Optimizely can map that C# class to that content type. If you don't provide a GUID, it will do the best it can with the class name, and it doesn't work very well. There are some other attributes that you can add to your class, which we'll get to eventually, but for now, this is like the bare minimum that you need to do. This is now going to be recognized as a content type within Optimizely. I'm going to go ahead and create another page type. And this is going to be for the terms of service. And typically, I try to make the terms of service or privacy pages basically as basic as they can be. So you want to give it a name like basic page, general page. Actually, I think I'll use general page. I would not recommend calling it generic page because generic is like a word with meaning in C#, so I find that a little bit confusing sometimes, but that's just my personal preference. Once again, general page extends page data. And type, we're going to annotate it as a content type. Go ahead and give it a GUID right away so I don't forget that. You can also group content. Let's put this in, we'll put this in a general content group. And then the homepage, I'm going to put in a group, let's call it specialized content. Just because, you typically don't want to have 10 different home pages, you just want one. Now, if we take a look at this page, and we're really just concerned with the content, we're not concerned with navigation. We have the terms of service, which is we'll call it a header. Then there's like a line of text here. We don't know how long that's going to be or what that's going to consist of, but we can just call that maybe headline slug, intro, whatever. And then we have this, which is basically just a big blob of HTML. So given all that, let's go ahead and create those properties. So we'll call it headline, and I'm just going to make it a plain string for now. Now, there's one important thing you've noticed is that the property type is virtual. This is required by the CMS. If I have a property that has a public getter and a public setter and it's not virtual, the site will actually complain upon startup. Now, technically, that's all I need to do. Optimizely will recognize this as a property and it will be editable. You can do some things though. Typically, we almost always have a display attribute coming from the component model. And you want to give it a name, headline, whoops. And very similar to the content types, or excuse me, the content type attribute, you can give it a group name. And I'm going to just pull group names from Episerver. So we're going to do system tab names, bring in that namespace dot content. And let's see here, what else is there? Oh, there's order. We'll start it at 10. So when you're looking at, oh, that's bad. A little bit of a mess. So when you're looking at Optimizely sites, you will often see the order goes up in groups of 10 or maybe 100 or whatever, basically so that, you know, if down the line you want to add a property that goes in between properties, you can just add it as like 15. You know, you've given yourself some room. You don't have to necessarily update every property that follows, but order is totally arbitrary. You can put whatever number you want. It just sorts in order. So we have a headline. We're going to call this next one the headline slug. And I'm just going to keep it a string for now, even though I know that's probably going to change. And then we have the body. But the body has some pretty odd, markup in it. We need to be able to do indenting. We need to do links and stuff. So we can't do a string. The way we work around that is to do an XHTML string, and we'll call this body and set it to property 30. Now these are the things that we can see. I'll go ahead and launch the site. Whoops. And now I should be able to actually create these pages. If I go to new page, we've got general page and home page. Go ahead and create a home page and publish it. Now the reason I need this home page to exist is so I can go into admin, go to config, go to manage websites, and I need to bind that home page to a domain. So the domain I happen to be using is just localhost. So we'll say this, and I'm just going to call this CMS from scratch. And I'm going to select homepage as my start page and hit create website. And so once I've done that, it will take my URL, which is localhost 5000, and basically create that as the primary host name. It can be worthwhile to also add a star binding and save that. So now any domain, you know, this main site in the tree, this homepage will work for basically a basic domain. And now that I've done that, I should be able to create a general page as well. And there it is. So yeah, we can see our properties here on the content tab as expected. Strings for headline and headline slug, and then we have the XHTML string, which presents in the CMS as basically a rich text editor. What we're looking at here is stock standard unconfigured rich text editor. We'll get into customizing that, you know, in a later video. But for now, this is a good start. There is a little more content though that we should probably manage, and it's not visible. If I view the page source, you know, we have things like the page title. We have meta tags where maybe it's the description. Maybe this is different from what you see on the page. So we should probably have fields for these. So let's go ahead and do that super quick here. And my Debug menu disappeared. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to put these for now above this content. Let's call this page title, for lack of a better term. I'm going to put this on a different group name. I don't think we necessarily want to use any of these. You could technically put it on the settings page. I prefer to just leave settings for things that are, really specific for Optimizely. I kind of leave that one alone. The page header one is interesting in that it basically shows up when you scroll up into, if you're on page editing. I'll show that later, but I don't want to use any of these, whoops, for now. So let's just give it our own. We'll call it the SEO tab. That's typically what we're putting in here. And then we'll do, what do we call it? Description? We'll call it meta description. And we'll make that on order 20. Notice that the ordering starts over because we're on our new tab. So we'll launch that again. Change that so it doesn't launch the browser automatically. But if we reload the page, we now see SEO shows up first. We can fix that later. And then there's content. There's our new fields. But these SEO fields aren't really specific to the general page. Like, they should be on the home page as well. There's a couple ways we could fix that. We could just grab all of these, pop over here to the home page and paste them in, and that technically works. It's not good. You're repeating yourself, and if we change any piece of either of these, we have to change it on every single page. But obviously these are C# classes, and obviously they're extending other C# classes, so we can use inheritance to put all of our properties that are belong to more than one content type in a base class. So we'll do that real quick. So what I'm going to do is create a base class, and I think what I'm going to call this is just basically, I'll call it an abstract content page. And the reason I'm calling it a content page is because it's a page that actually renders HTML, which differentiates it from things like container pages that typically don't render anything. They usually just redirect somewhere. They're really just meant for organizing content in the hierarchy within the CMS. Whoops. Page data. So we'll go ahead and make this extend page data, and I like to make this abstract, and I'm going to make general page extend abstract content page. Now I can move these properties to the abstract type, and as far as the CMS is concerned, these properties now exist on general page. The CMS doesn't really care that these are inherited. And then what I can do is go back to my home page and have it also extend abstract content page. Now my home page will also get these new properties. So if I launch, reload, ignore this browser, switch back up to the home page, now the home page has an SEO tab. It did not get any other properties because it's not inheriting any and we didn't create any, but it does have the SEO properties. So the last thing I'm going to do, one very small tweak. You may have noticed as I was working on this that we've got the squigglies underneath a few of our properties, and the compiler is complaining that these are non-nullable properties that are basically null. So what it's really saying is we have a property with a public getter and setter, but no initializer. Because I'm using nullable reference types, and I don't have the question mark here, I am telling the compiler headline cannot be null. But because it has no initializer, it is null. At least it will be by default. And so I'm sort of violating that contract. All I need to do is acknowledge to the compiler that, yeah, headline can be null, and then I don't have to initialize it. And that is true of any of the reference types that I'm using as properties. So if I just run through here, same thing on my abstract page type. And that takes care of the squiggles. And will also help in like any controllers or views, anywhere where I might be accessing this information. It will remind me that, hey, this could be null, and I have to acknowledge that, or the compiler will complain. And so there we have a very brief introduction to the concepts of content modeling, the briefest of introductions of actually creating content in the CMS. We've created sort of 2-page types, though there's a lot of work left to be done there. Next time, we'll take a stab at creating some media types and some block types. And if that goes fast enough, maybe even rendering some stuff out to the browser. So I hope this video is useful for you. Thanks for your time.